Hello everyone, welcome to Marco's BL Love. Please enjoy this video.
The phone call lasts 40 seconds. Sophie's voice is careful, the way it gets when the news is bad enough to rap gently. "He is telling everyone you had a breakdown," she says. "He is telling everyone you were unstable." I am standing in a stranger's kitchen with my hands around a coffee cup that someone else made for me, and I feel something move through me that is not grief and not shame. It is the cold, clean anger of a person who has finally stopped being afraid of the truth. Ronan had 3 years to know me. He chose a story instead. And now I have the Harlow Project, a solicitor with new documentation, and absolutely nothing left to lose. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. My name is Emmett Vale, and the night that changed everything began with smoke and a locked door, and the particular cruelty of a relationship that had been ending for a long time before I finally admitted it to myself. I was 26 years old, and I had been living with Ronan for 3 years. 3 years of telling myself that the way he spoke to me was not cruelty, but honesty. That the way he made decisions without asking me was not control, but confidence. That the way he looked at me, sometimes, like I was an inconvenience he had not yet figured out how to resolve, was simply stress from his work, and not the true temperature of what he felt. I was an omega, and Ronan was an alpha, and I had grown up in a family that believed very firmly in the old hierarchies, the ones that said an omega's highest purpose was to be wanted by someone strong enough to claim them. So I had taken wanting as a substitute for love, and I had called the arrangement a life. My hair was the kind of pale blonde that Ronan had described on the first night we met as striking, and which he had described on many subsequent nights as impractical or expensive to maintain, or simply with a dismissive gesture at my reflection that I was slender, and I moved quietly through spaces, which Ronan liked because he found excess noise irritating, and I cooked well and kept the apartment orderly and managed his social calendar and had built, brick by brick, a life that was entirely structured around his comfort and not at all around mine. I had known for perhaps 6 months that I was going to leave. I had known, and I had not acted, because I had nowhere to go, no family close enough to absorb me without drama, no savings that were not connected to accounts Ronan managed, no friends who had not slowly become his friends instead of mine over the 3 years of careful social reshaping he had conducted without ever appearing to conduct it. I had been afraid, and I had stayed afraid, and I had told myself I would figure it out. I would find the moment. I would wait for the right circumstances. The fire was not the right circumstances. It was simply circumstances. It started, the fire marshal's report would later confirm, in the electrical panel of the unit directly below ours, the result of outdated wiring that the building management had been cited for twice in the previous 18 months, and had failed to address either time. It spread through the building's dry internal walls with a speed that the report described as consistent with the age and construction type of the structure. By the time the smoke alarms in our unit activated, the stairwell was already compromised. I was alone in the apartment. Ronan had been at a work dinner for 3 hours, a dinner I had not been invited to and had learned about from the entry on his calendar rather than from him directly. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at the potted herb garden I had grown on the windowsill, because growing things gave me a feeling of agency that nothing else in the apartment did when the alarm began. I did what I had always done in moments of crisis. I stayed calm. I moved to the door and pressed my hand to it before opening, the way you were supposed to, and felt no heat, and opened it to find the hallway already hazy with smoke. I went back inside. I gathered the things that mattered. My medication, my phone, the small box I kept at the back of the wardrobe that contained the few documents that were genuinely mine, my passport, and my qualification certificates, and the photograph of my mother that I had kept since her death 4 years ago. I closed the box. I went to the door. I put on shoes. I made it to the end of the hallway before the smoke thickened in a way that disoriented me completely. The building was old, and the corridors were narrow, and the smoke was not the clean, theatrical smoke of safety demonstrations, but something choking and physical, a presence that pressed against the eyes and throat, and made all navigation feel like guessing. I found a wall. I followed it. I found a door that I was almost certain was the stairwell and pushed through it, and immediately understood that it was not, because there were no stairs, and the smoke here was considerably worse. I do not know how long I was in that room. Long enough for the light to change quality through the small window above me. Long enough for the sound of the building doing terrible things to become the whole world. Long enough to stop being calm. The door opened from the outside. He filled the frame in full firefighting gear, his helmet casting his face in shadow, his black hair visible at the edges, where the helmet sat pushed back slightly, his voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that went past my ears and into some more animal part of my processing. "Here," he said, "I have you. Take my hand." I took his hand. He moved through the smoke with the certainty of someone who had memorized the building before entering it, pulling me behind him with a grip that was firm but careful, the kind of grip that communicates both strength and the awareness that strength can be a harm if it is not modulated. We went downstairs I could not see. We went through a door, and then there was cool air and the sound of the city doing its ordinary, indifferent business, and I was sitting on a low brick wall across the street, while the building behind us shuddered with the effort of its own destruction. He crouched in front of me. He had pushed the helmet back. In the shifting light of the emergency vehicles, his face was sharp-featured and tired-looking, in the way that people look when they work long hours in difficult conditions, as a matter of routine, dark eyes taking in my condition with professional efficiency, moving from my face to my hands to the box I was holding against my chest with both arms. "You got your things," he observed. "I always know what matters," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice was. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good. Are you hurt anywhere?" I did not think I was. I told him so. He nodded and called a paramedic over and stood back while she assessed me, and when she had confirmed that I was intact and would likely remain so, he came back. "My name is Cade Strawn," he said. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" This was, in its way, the most devastating question I had been asked in some time, because the honest answer was complex and the simple answer was no, and I was not yet certain which version of the truth I was prepared to articulate to a stranger on a pavement with a burning building behind me. "My partner is on his way," I said. "He will sort something out." Ronan arrived 20 minutes later. He had come from the dinner, still in the dark suit he wore for client events, his alpha pheromones rolling off him in the distracted way they did when he was irritated but suppressing the expression of it. He looked at the building. He looked at me. He looked at the box I was holding. "Of course you grabbed that instead of anything useful," he said. This was not cruelty. Or rather, it was the kind of cruelty that does not know it is cruelty, the kind that is simply the unguarded expression of a person's actual opinion of you. I had heard it so many times that it had almost stopped registering. Almost. I took a step toward him. He was already on his phone. "I need to call my assistant and find us somewhere for tonight," he said, without looking at me. "Corporate rate at the Vantage, I think." He moved away. He was talking before the call connected. I stood on the pavement with my box and my phone and my pharmaceutical case and the specific quality of understanding that arrives when you have been told the truth about something so many times that you have finally run out of the energy required to keep not hearing it. I looked at Ronan standing 20 feet away, back to me, gesturing at something on the horizon as he spoke, and I thought with perfect and sudden clarity that I could not do this anymore. Not the fire, not the apartment, not any of it. I looked down at my phone. I looked at the contact card that had been sent to me 17 minutes ago by the paramedic who had treated me, who had passed along the information at the request of the firefighter who had carried me out. A standard courtesy, she said, in case I needed a contact for the incident documentation. Cade Strawn, Station 4, Kelvin District. A number, an email. I sent a message. I apologize for the presumption. You asked if I had somewhere to go, Ed. It turns out I do not. Is the offer you did not make but implied still available? I stood very still and watched Ronan on the phone and waited. The reply came in 4 minutes. Yes. Meet me at the station when my shift ends at 6. I will arrange the rest." I took a breath. I picked up my box. I walked to where Ronan was still talking, and I stood in his eyeline until he looked at me with the particular expression he wore when I was interrupting something that mattered. "I am going to stay with a friend tonight," I said. "You should take the hotel." He looked at me for a long moment. His expression did something complicated and then resolved into relief, which told me everything I had needed to know for the past 6 months and had been too afraid to simply see. "Fine," he said. "We will deal with the rest in the morning." We did not deal with anything in the morning. We did not need to, because by morning I had already begun understanding that there was not going to be a morning that belonged to us, that the thing I had been building for 3 years was finished, and that the fire had simply been honest about it, in a way that neither of us had managed to be. The station house of Station 4 was a broad, low building, 3 streets from the Kelvin District waterfront, smelling of metal and cleaning products, and the particular baked warmth of a building that runs its heating high year-round, because the people inside it need to be ready to move at any moment. I arrived at 10 minutes past 6 with my box and my phone and nothing else, and sat on a bench outside the main entrance, feeling the specific unreality of having made a decision that has no obvious reversal. Cade Strawn came out in street clothes, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his black hair damp from a shower, the lines of his face less shadowed than they had been in the emergency lights, but carrying the same quality of attentive assessment. He looked at me, and then at the box, and then back at me with something that was not pity, because pity looks down and this looked across. "You left him," he said. It was not a question. "I did not leave him," I said. "I simply became honest about the fact that the thing I was staying for no longer existed." He considered this for a moment. "Same outcome," he said. Yes, I agreed. Same outcome. He had a car, a practical dark vehicle that smelled inside of cedar and metal polish, and very faintly of something warm that I registered in the back of my throat before I could stop myself registering it. I was on a low dose of pheromone suppressants, had been for 2 years, because Ronan found the experience of a fully unsuppressed Omega in close quarters overwhelming in a way he had described to me as distracting, and the low dose meant my sensitivity was dampened but not eliminated. I noticed his scent the way you notice a piece of music playing in another room, present and identifiable, but not demanding. He drove without making unnecessary conversation, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. He asked me once if I had eaten, and when I said no, he stopped at a noodle place that was still open and came back with 2 containers and ate his without watching me eat mine, which was a particular and specific courtesy that I did not expect, and that landed somewhere in my chest with a warmth I was not prepared for. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 8 minutes from the station. It was the kind of apartment that belongs to someone who spends a great deal of time away from it and has furnished it accordingly, functional and clean, with a reading chair by the window that had been used extensively, and a kitchen that was adequately equipped, and nothing on the walls except one photograph above the desk of a mountain range that I did not recognize, but that gave the impression of enormous distance. The spare room had a bed and a window that looked onto the building's shared courtyard. It was not large, but it was clean, and it was, in the most essential sense of the word, quiet. "You can stay as long as you need to," he said from the doorway. "There is a spare key on the hook by the door. If you need anything in the night, my room is at the end of the hall." He paused. "Do not feel you need to explain yourself or account for your time or be anything in particular. You have had a significant day." I stood in the middle of the spare room with my box against my chest and looked at him and thought that I had been explained and accounted for and required to be something in particular for 3 years, and that I had not realized until this moment how heavy that weight was, because I had been carrying it for so long that I had mistaken it for my own skeleton. "Thank you," I said. "I mean that completely." He nodded. He left. I heard him move down the hall, and the quiet sound of a door closing, and then the apartment was still. I set the box on the floor beside the bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I pressed the heels of my hands against my closed eyes and breathed very carefully for a long time, and when I finally lay down and pulled the blanket over myself, I thought that the room smelled faintly of cedar and warmth, and that I was going to think about that later, when I had more cognitive resources available for the thinking. I did not sleep so much as fall unconscious from the accumulated weight of the day, but before I did, I lay in the dark and felt the particular strangeness of a moment that exists before everything changes, when you can feel the change coming but cannot yet see its shape, and I thought that whatever came next, I had at least made a true decision, possibly the first one I had made purely for myself in 3 years. Morning arrived, as mornings do, indifferent to the scale of what the night before has contained. I woke to the sound of the city resuming its business outside the courtyard window, and lay very still for a moment, remembering where I was and why, and then I got up and went to the kitchen. Cade was already there, in the dark uniform trousers and department shirt that meant he had an early shift, making coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who has performed this action while still partly asleep, a very large number of times. He glanced up when I appeared in the doorway. "Coffee is ready," he said. "There is bread and eggs. Help yourself to whatever is there." I thanked him. I made eggs because doing something with my hands helped me feel like a person with agency and competence, which I needed to feel this morning more than most. He sat at the counter with his coffee and looked at his phone, and did not hover or monitor or require me to account for my presence in his kitchen. It was extraordinary how comfortable this silence was. He left for his shift at 7:30. Before he went, he put a spare set of keys on the counter and said he would be back by 4, and that there was a corner shop 2 streets west if I needed anything. He did not ask what my plans were or suggest what they should be. He simply left me the information I needed to navigate the day and trusted me to do the navigating. I spent the day in stages. First, I called Ronan, which was a conversation I had been constructing in my mind since the previous night, and which was shorter and less dramatic than 3 years of accumulated avoidance had led me to expect. He said that he supposed he had seen this coming. I said that I supposed I had too. He said that we would need to discuss the practicalities. I said we would, and that I would contact him when I had a fixed address to give him. He said fine. He said nothing else. The call ended. I sat with the phone in my lap for a while and waited to feel devastated. What I felt instead was a deep and physical tiredness, the kind that follows long exertion rather than sudden shock, as if my body had been holding tension for months and was now slowly, cautiously releasing it. Then I called my workplace. I was an interior designer, junior partner at a small firm, and my colleague Petra answered with the warmth of someone who had been watching my situation from the outside for some time and was not surprised by any of its developments. She said, "Take whatever time you need." She said the Harlow project can wait a week. She said, after a pause, "I always thought that apartment had bad energy." I laughed, which surprised me. It felt strange in my mouth, like a word I had not spoken in a long time. Then I sat at Cade's kitchen table and made a list, because lists were how I organized chaos, and the list was called Things That Belong to Me, and another list called Things I Need That I Do Not Have, and a third list called Questions I Need to Answer, and working through all 3 took most of the morning and left me feeling something that resembled, however distantly, control. In the afternoon, I went to the corner shop 2 streets west and bought groceries because I needed to do something useful with the day, and because there is a particular human satisfaction in filling a refrigerator with things that can become meals. I learned that Cade had approximately the right spices and approximately the wrong knives, and approximately no vegetables whatsoever, and I corrected the vegetable situation and left the spices as they were, and decided the knives were a later problem. He came back at 4:15. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the groceries arrayed on the counter in preparation for the soup I was making, and did not say anything for a moment. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "I needed something to do." He nodded. He went to change out of his uniform and came back in the gray sweater that I had noted the previous evening looked like something that had been washed a great many times and had achieved a softness through experience rather than design. He sat at the counter and watched me cook without making it feel like surveillance. He asked questions, genuine ones with actual interest behind them, about the design work, about the projects I was working on, about how I had come to the profession. His questions made me feel that my answers mattered, which was a sensation I was relearning how to have. We ate the soup at the kitchen table. He said it was very good. I said, "Thank you." He said he had not had a meal cooked in this kitchen in approximately 4 months, since the last time his sister had visited. I said his sister sounded sensible. He agreed that she was, and that she frequently pointed this out. I learned things about him over that dinner, the way you learn things about people when the conversation is real rather than performed. He had been a firefighter for 6 years, having come to it from a short and unsatisfying period working in logistics that he described as deeply wrong in the way that a note played in the wrong key is deeply wrong. He was 32 years old. He had lived in this city his entire life, which meant he knew it in the specific and granular way that people who have moved around a great deal can never quite replicate, knowing not just streets and landmarks, but the way light falls differently in the western districts in winter, and which markets are worth waking early for, and where the building codes had been quietly ignored for decades in ways that created exactly the kind of fire risk that had taken my apartment the previous night. He was alpha. This I had known from the moment in the smoke when his scent reached me, known it with the bone-deep certainty that Omega biology provides on this particular question, and I had been managing its implications carefully all day with the help of my suppressants and what I told myself was an adequate reserve of rational self-control. I was managing it fine. I was managing it very well, in fact, all the way through dinner, and the clearing up, and the moment when he said good night, and I said good night, and I went to the spare room and closed the door and sat on the bed and breathed through the way his scent lingered in the spaces of the apartment, the way cedar smoke lingers after a fire, present and complicated, and not at all possible to ignore. I was managing it fine. And then, some hours into the night, with the city quiet outside and the apartment still, I stopped managing it. It is difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it from the inside what an omega heat feels like at its onset, because the language available for the description tends toward the dramatic in ways that miss the actual texture of the thing. It is not sudden. It does not arrive with a bell or a flag or a clear announcement of its nature. It arrives the way a tide arrives, which is to say, through gradual and persistent accumulation, until the point at which the water is simply everywhere, and the question of when it arrived is no longer interesting. My heats had been irregular for years, suppressed and managed and pharmaceutically delayed in the interest of Ronan's preference for a predictable domestic environment. My suppressant prescription was, I realized now with the specific horror of very bad timing, in the pharmaceutical case I had grabbed the previous night, which meant I had the medication, and which also meant that I had neglected to take the evening dose in the chaos of everything else. Missed dose. Stress response. Proximity to an unmated alpha whose scent my body had apparently been cataloging and responding to since the moment I first inhaled it in a burning corridor. I sat up in bed and pressed my hands flat against the mattress and acknowledged what was happening to me with as much clinical detachment as I could marshal, which was rapidly becoming not very much clinical detachment at all. My skin felt 2 sizes too small. The air in the room was too cold and too thin. The cedar and warmth scent that I had been telling myself was a manageable background presence had become, in the absence of my missed suppressant dose, and in the accumulated biological response of proximity to compatible chemistry, something far more than a background presence. I took 3 measured breaths. I got up. I went to my pharmaceutical case and found the missed dose and took it immediately, which was going to help in approximately 4 to 6 hours, and was therefore not going to help with the immediate situation. I stood in the middle of the spare room in the dark and conducted a rapid and entirely rational assessment of my options. The rational thing to do was to manage this privately, quietly, without involving the person who had offered me shelter and asked nothing in return. I had managed heats alone before, during the times when Ronan had been traveling and had not been available, and had not particularly wanted to be available. I was not incapable of it. The problem, the one I was running into now as I stood in the dark and felt the tide continuing to rise, was that my body had apparently already decided that the compatible chemistry on the other side of this apartment wall was relevant information for the current situation, and my body was not taking my rational assessment into consideration. I went to the kitchen. I filled a glass with cold water and drank it standing at the counter with the light off because the light felt wrong. The cedar scent was stronger in the kitchen, present in the fabric of the space, and I gripped the counter with both hands and told myself that I was fine, that this was manageable, that I was not going to do anything I had not chosen to do. The light in the hallway came on. His door opened. Footsteps, unhurried, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for sleep, his black hair disordered, his expression carrying the particular quality of someone who has woken with clear knowledge of why they have woken. He was Alpha, and he had woken because his biology had answered mine across the shared space of the apartment, which was something that could not be faked and could not be mistaken, and which neither of us was in any position to pretend had not happened. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at me, and he did not move toward me. He did not fill the space with alpha authority, or pheromone pressure, or any of the dynamics that an alpha could deploy in this situation if they chose to. He simply stood, and he looked at me, and he said, very quietly, "I am going to help you through this." And then he asked me what I needed. I stared at him. The water glass was still in my hand. The cedar scent of him was everywhere, and my body was answering it in ways I was losing my ability to control, and I was fully and completely aware that this was a moment of genuine choice, that whatever I said next was going to be a decision I had made rather than a decision that had been made for me. "I need you to not pretend this is not happening," I said. "Because it is, and I cannot manage it the way I usually manage it, and I am not going to ask you for anything you do not want to give." He moved then. Not toward me, not yet, just away from the doorway and into the kitchen, taking the space down from its charged quality to something that was still significant, but that had room in it for what came next. He set his own glass on the counter. He looked at me with those dark eyes that had, I realized, not once looked at me as a problem or an inconvenience or a function of my designation, rather than a person. "I want to help you," he said, "but I want you to tell me what you want. Not what you need, not what the biology is asking for. What you want, Emmett. What you choose." No one had asked me that in 3 years. What do you want? Not what do you require, not what is expected or appropriate or convenient. What do you want? As if the wanting of it was a valid and sufficient basis for having it. I set the water glass down. I looked at him. I said, "I want you to come over here." He came over here. What happened next was not the urgent catastrophe that unmanaged heats are sometimes described as in the kind of fiction that treats omega biology as a plot device rather than a human experience. It was not without intensity, but it was something that I had not encountered in 3 years of a relationship that had technically included this kind of intimacy, which was the experience of being with someone who kept checking, who kept asking, who treated the heat not as something to get through or manage or satisfy as efficiently as possible, but as a conversation between two people who were choosing each other in real time. The cedar scent of him was no longer something I was managing. It was simply where I was, the way warmth is where you are when you are beside something warm, and my body, which had been locked into careful performance and careful suppression for so long, found something in it that was less like relief and more like recognition, like a chord resolving after a very long suspension. He was patient with me in a way that I did not know how to receive at first, because patience in intimacy was not something I had been accustomed to, and I found myself stopping to look at him in the middle of things to check that he was real, and that this was real, and that the choice I had made was still a choice I was making freely. Every time I looked at him, he looked back. He did not look away. He did not look at something else or somewhere else. He looked at me as if I was what he was here for, which, in that moment, I was. By the time the worst of the biological urgency had passed and the room had gone quiet in the particular way that follows significant things, we were lying in the spare room in the gray before dawn, and I was more relaxed than I had been in months and possibly years, and Cade Strawn was lying beside me, with his arm careful and unhurried around my shoulders, and neither of us was talking yet because the moment did not require it. He spoke first. Eventually, "Are you all right?" I considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Yes," I said. I think I actually am." He was quiet for a moment. His arm did not move. The gray light was becoming slowly, incrementally, something closer to morning. "This does not have to mean anything you do not want it to mean," he said. "I want you to know that. You do not owe me a story or an interpretation because of tonight. Whatever you need this to be, I will follow your lead." I looked at the ceiling of the spare room. I thought about 3 years of following someone else's lead, of shaping myself to fit a space that had been designed without consulting me. I thought about how I had arrived in this apartment with a box of documents and a pharmaceutical case and nothing else, and how the person lying beside me had offered me shelter without conditions and asked what I wanted before he gave me anything. "What if I told you," I said, "that I want to figure out what this is? Not decide it, not define it, just figure it out carefully, over time, with actual information." He was quiet for a moment that was not an uncertain quiet, but a considering one. Then he said, "That sounds like the most sensible thing I have heard in a long time." I turned my head to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling too, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it had done on the pavement outside the burning building, the movement that was related to a smile. "I should tell you," I said. "I do not have a permanent address currently." "I am aware," he said. "Or furniture. Also aware. Or a plan." He turned his head and looked at me with those dark, direct eyes. "You have a plan," he said. "It is simply new. New plans feel like the absence of a plan for a little while. That is normal." I stared at him. "What kind of person," I said, "says something that true at 5 in the morning?" "The kind that does this for a living," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made me understand he did not mean firefighting, or at least not only firefighting. He meant the part of the work that was about arriving in catastrophe and finding the people in it, and asking them what they needed and helping them toward the door. I closed my eyes. The morning was arriving now in earnest, pushing at the edges of the curtains, filling the room with the particular gray-gold light of a city waking up. Somewhere outside, someone was already moving through their morning, and the ordinary business of the world was resuming, without particular regard for the fact that inside this room, something had begun. I had arrived here with nothing but the things that mattered, and it turned out that what mattered had been a narrower list than I had spent 3 years assembling, and that the narrowest version of it was simply this: being somewhere I had chosen, with someone who had asked. But I was not finished choosing, I understood. The heat had passed, and the emergency of the previous night had settled into the specific ordinary daylight quality of the morning after, and what came now was the work of figuring out what I was actually building, and whether I was building it with clear eyes and genuine decision, or with a particular desperation that follows a collapse and looks like clarity from the inside. I was going to be careful. I was going to be honest. I was going to ask myself, regularly, what I wanted, the way he had asked me in the kitchen, and I was going to answer it truthfully even when the truth was uncomfortable. But first, I thought, I was going to sleep for a few more hours in the early light, with his arm around my shoulders and the cedar scent of him present in the air, and I was going to let that be exactly what it was without asking it to be anything more or less. The morning could wait. It was, after all, still arriving. There were, however, things I did not yet know. I did not know that the building management company responsible for the fire had already begun a process of quietly reassigning liability that would, in 3 weeks, result in a settlement offer that was both insulting and revealing about the company's internal decision-making. I did not know that Ronan's immediate response to my departure had been to tell 3 mutual acquaintances a version of events that cast my leaving as a kind of instability rather than a decision, which was a thing I would learn about later, with a clarity that would make me very glad I had already left. And I did not know that Cade Strawn had a history, a particular and significant one involving a previous relationship that had ended in a way that had left him careful in specific and deliberate ways that I was not yet aware of. I would learn all of these things, but the morning after the night I moved into his apartment and went into heat in his kitchen, I did not know any of them yet. What I knew was the light coming through the curtains and the city waking up outside, and the fact of having made, finally, a true choice. And for the moment, That was enough to begin with. The suppressants began working by mid-morning, bringing my biology back to something that felt like my own again. The particular relief of being in one's own body after a period of it doing something outside of one's ordinary experience. I woke to find the other side of the bed empty and the smell of coffee coming under the door, and I lay still for a long moment and conducted an honest inventory of how I felt. Not regret. That was the first and most important finding. I had expected regret, had braced for it the way you brace for pain that does not arrive, and its absence was itself a kind of information. Not embarrassment either, or at least not the crippling variety. Something smaller and more manageable, the mild social self-consciousness of having been very thoroughly known by someone I had met 48 hours ago, which was unusual, but which I had chosen, and which therefore sat differently than embarrassment usually sat. What I felt, primarily and most genuinely, was rested, which was either a simple physical fact or something considerably more interesting, and I was not yet ready to determine which. I got up. I found my clothes from the previous day and dressed. I went to the bathroom that smelled of cedar and the particular neutral soap of someone who has opinions about cleanliness but not about fragrance. I looked at my face in the mirror, which was the face of someone who had lost an apartment and a relationship and a carefully constructed life in the course of a single evening and had, in the immediate aftermath of all of that, made a decision that could not be undecided. I looked, I thought, more like myself than I had in a while. This was interesting information. He was in the kitchen when I emerged, off shift today, in the gray sweater and dark trousers, reading something on his phone, with the focused quality of someone who reads rather than scrolls. He looked up when I came in. He did not perform casualness. He simply looked at me the way he always looked at me, which was directly and without deflection. "Coffee," he said. "There are eggs if you want them." "I want them," I said, because I was going to practice saying what I wanted, starting now, with small things, in preparation for being able to say it about larger things later. He nodded and put the phone down, and took the eggs out of the refrigerator, and began making them without being asked and without making it into an event. I sat at the counter with the coffee, and thought about the fact that I was going to need to begin making practical arrangements today. The insurance call, the conversation with my firm about remote work while I established a new base, the long list of addresses that needed updating. I thought about the fact that I had approximately 3 weeks of things to do before I would have clarity about where I was landing, and that those 3 weeks would happen somewhere, and that somewhere was currently here. "I have to make some calls today," I said, "for the insurance and the address situation." He put a plate of eggs in front of me. "Take the kitchen table," he said. "I have things to do." He would not hover or supervise. He would simply be present and available, and I was understanding that this was simply how he was, that the quality of care he had shown from the beginning was not a performance for the immediate crisis, but the ordinary expression of who he was. "Thank you," I said, "for last night." He sat down across from me with his own coffee. He looked at me. "Which part?" he said. "All of it," I said. "The asking, the following my lead." His expression did something quiet and precise. "That is not remarkable," he said. "That is just what it should be." "I know," I said. "I am learning to notice when things are what they should be." He looked at me for a long moment with those dark eyes that I had decided, a particular quality of attention that was different from watching, the kind of looking that involves actually seeing. Then he picked up his coffee and turned back to his phone and let me eat my eggs in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen and the morning. Outside, the city was doing its business. Somewhere across the district, the building on Fenwick Street was being assessed and documented and added to the long list of structures that had failed the people inside them. Ronan was, in all probability, in a hotel room telling the story of our relationship in a way that made him its center. The ordinary machinery of my previous life was processing its own ending with the impersonal efficiency of machinery. And here, in a kitchen that smelled of cedar and coffee and the eggs I was eating, something else was beginning. Carefully, and without a clear shape yet, and with a great deal of honest work still ahead. But beginning. That was, I thought, enough for a morning. The rest could come when it came. The practical work of dismantling a life is less dramatic than the emotional work, and considerably more time-consuming. I learned this over the first week in Cade's apartment, during which I made an average of 7 phone calls per day, each one requiring me to explain a situation that had no clean summary and to navigate the particular bureaucratic indifference of institutions that process displacement as a category rather than as something that has happened to a specific person with a specific history and a specific box of documents sitting on the floor of a borrowed spare room. The insurance company sent an assessor. The assessor sent a form. The form required documentation that the fire had destroyed, which required a letter from the fire department confirming the incident, which required a call to the district office, which required me to be transferred 4 times before reaching someone who could help me. I sat at Cade's kitchen table with my phone and my lists and worked through all of it with the focused, methodical efficiency that I had always applied to other people's problems in my design work and was now discovering I could apply with some effort to my own. My firm, meanwhile, was generous. Petra managed the client communications. My projects were redistributed temporarily and then redistributed back to me as I established my remote working capacity, setting up my laptop at the kitchen table and learning the quality of the light there at different hours of the day, which was good in the mornings and complicated by afternoon glare in the late hours, which I resolved by moving to the reading chair by the window, which had the advantage of being deeply comfortable and the disadvantage of being the kind of comfortable that occasionally caused me to fall asleep over reference materials. Cade did not comment on the spreading occupation of his apartment by my work materials. He moved around my spread of samples and reference books and sticky-noted floor plans with the same easy accommodation he brought to everything, and when I apologized on the 4th day for the state of the kitchen table, he looked at the organized chaos of it and said it looked like someone was actually using the apartment, which he seemed to regard as an improvement on its previous condition. The previous condition, I had gathered, had been that of a space inhabited at the edges, used for sleeping and eating and the minimum domestic maintenance, but not lived in the way that spaces become homes, which requires a certain investment of presence and particularity that Cade had apparently not been making for some time. His refrigerator had been a study in minimalism before I had addressed it. His bookshelves held a great number of books, but no objects, no accumulated small things, nothing that spoke of the kind of comfortable accumulation that happens when a person has settled rather than simply stopped moving. I asked him about this on the 5th day, when we were eating dinner, which had become a shared activity by default because I cooked in the evenings, and there was always enough for 2, and he always came home from shift with the particular appetite of someone who has been running on station house coffee and adrenaline for 9 hours. "You do not own very many things," I said. He looked up from his plate, with the assessing expression he wore when he was deciding how truthful to be. Then he said, "There was a previous arrangement that resolved itself about 18 months ago, and I removed a number of things afterward. I have not replaced them. I considered this." "What kind of arrangement?" I said. "A partnership," he said. "We lived together for 2 years. When it ended, I found I had kept very few things that were genuinely mine rather than ours, and I had not been certain what to replace them with. So I had not. I looked around the kitchen, seeing it now with this information layered over it. The single photograph above the desk, the reading chair by the window that had been used extensively, suggesting long evenings spent alone. The way he had offered me the spare room without any particular adjustment, as if accommodating another person's presence was something he had simply not done in a while, and was finding the return to it easier than expected. "Are you all right?" I said. "About it?" He looked at me steadily. "Yes," he said. "It took some time, but yes." He paused. "Are you asking because you want to know, or because you are calculating what it means for us?" "Both," I said, "and I'm telling you so rather than pretending it is only one." Something shifted in his expression, a fractional thing, a slight easing of the steadiness into something warmer. "That is," he said, "exactly the kind of answer I appreciate." "Tell me about it," I said, "if you want to." He did, over the rest of dinner and the clearing up and the 2 cups of tea that followed, in the measured, unhurried way that he told things, without editing for effect, and without the particular performance of vulnerability that people sometimes deploy when they are trying to generate sympathy rather than simply being honest. His name had been Piers. He was a beta, a lawyer, precise and ambitious and genuinely brilliant, and Cade had loved him with the specific and trusting completeness of someone who had not yet learned to hold some part of themselves in reserve. They had been happy, and then they had been less happy, and then they had been honest about it, which had been painful and necessary, and ultimately the kinder option despite feeling like the opposite at the time. He did not love him anymore, he said, with the particular clarity of someone who has made sure of this rather than simply assuming it. But he had not, since Piers, allowed himself to want anything with the same unchecked confidence. He had kept things measured, appropriate, at a distance that felt like caution, but that he was aware, on reflection, was perhaps closer to avoidance. And then, he said, there was a residential fire in the Kelvin district, and a person in a storage room who was holding a box of documents and telling him he always knew what mattered. I looked at him across the kitchen table. The evening was quiet around us, the city doing its ordinary nocturnal business beyond the window. "I am not Piers," I said. "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I find notable about you. I am also," I said, "not a version of anyone you have known before. I am a version of myself that is new, because I am still figuring out which parts of the previous version were mine and which were assembled for someone else's convenience. I want to be honest about that. It means I may not always know what I want immediately. It means I am learning to ask myself the question you asked me in the kitchen, and the answer is not always available on demand." He nodded. "I am not in a hurry," he said. "I know you are not," I said. "I want you to know that I notice it, that it is not lost on me." He looked at me for a moment that had the quality of something being carefully and voluntarily placed. Then he picked up his tea and said, "Tell me about the Harlow project," and I understood that he was giving me space to come back from the significant thing we had just said to each other without requiring me to stay in it longer than I wanted to, which was itself a form of the care I was learning to recognize and receive. Ronan called on the 8th day. I had been expecting this, not the call itself, but the version of events that preceded it, which I had learned about through a message from a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Sophie, who had technically been Ronan's friend first, but who had, over 3 years, become something more genuinely mine, and who now sent me a message that said, "He is telling people you had a breakdown. I thought you should know. I do not believe him." I replied to Sophie first, thanking her, and telling her a brief and accurate version of events that she could deploy as she chose in whatever conversation she found herself in. Then I sat with the knowledge of what Ronan was saying about me, and felt the particular cold anger that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, the feeling of a thing you already knew being proven true in a way that removes the last of your uncertainty. When Ronan called, I answered on the second ring. He said several things about the practicalities of unwinding our shared life, which I listened to and responded to clearly and without unnecessary emotion, because the practicalities required clarity, and the emotion was mine to keep or spend as I chose, rather than to perform for his benefit. He said, toward the end of the conversation, that he hoped I was managing, and that he was concerned about my state of mind, given recent events. I said very calmly that my state of mind was the clearest it had been in approximately 3 years, and that I hoped the same was true for him, and that I would send the relevant documentation by the end of the week. Then I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table afterward and thought about anger, about the specific quality of anger that comes when you have been diminished by someone who had the opportunity to know you properly, and chose instead to construct a version of you that fit their needs, and who continues, even in the aftermath, to do this, recasting your clarity as instability, your decision as dysfunction. The anger was clean, I noted, not the hot, chaotic anger of the betrayed, but the cool, precise anger of the correctly informed. It did not require expression. It required, if anything, the simple act of no longer being subject to the thing that had caused it. I was no longer subject to it. That was already true. The anger acknowledged this and then settled, like a tool replaced in its correct position after use. Cade came home that afternoon and I told him about the call with a brevity that communicated the essential facts without requiring him to carry the emotional weight of it. He listened. He said, "Do you want to talk about it more?" I said, "No, not tonight." "No." He said, "All right," and made coffee, and the evening proceeded with the easy, ordinary quality that evenings in this apartment had begun to have, and that I was coming to rely on in a way that I was trying to monitor without becoming afraid of. On the 10th day, I had a meeting with a solicitor about the insurance settlement. The building management company, as I had already gathered from the preliminary communications, was attempting to manage its liability in a way that prioritized its financial exposure over the legitimate claims of the 12 displaced residents. The offer on the table was, as my solicitor described it with professional understatement, ungenerous. "I am not accepting it," I told her. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who was accustomed to clients accepting ungenerous offers because they needed the money immediately and did not have the reserves to wait for a better one. "I understand," she said. "It will take longer." "I understand," I said. "I am not accepting it." She nodded and made a note and began the process of declining and counter-proposing, which would take weeks and which I was prepared for. I had been a junior partner at a design firm for 4 years. I knew how to negotiate for what something was actually worth, which was a skill I had applied exclusively to other people's projects and was now learning to apply to my own circumstances. I went from the solicitor's office to a cafe 3 streets from Cade's apartment that I had begun to use as a working location on the afternoons when the apartment felt too still. I ordered coffee and sat at a window table and opened my laptop and worked on the Harlow project for 2 hours with the focused, productive quality that had been returning to me incrementally since the fire, the sense of being present in my work rather than present in the performance of work. My phone rang. Unknown number, which I might have ignored under ordinary circumstances, but something made me answer. "Is this Emmett Vale?" said a voice I did not recognize. "I used to own the building on Fenwick Street." I sat very still. "Yes," I said. His name was Edmund Ferris, and he was 71 years old, and he had sold the building to the management company 4 years ago after his wife died, and he had no longer had the energy to manage it properly himself. He had seen the news coverage of the fire. He had been sick about it for a week. He was calling because he had obtained the contact information for the displaced residents from a community advocacy organization, and he wanted to say personally that he was sorry, and also to say that if anyone needed a reference for the management company's prior knowledge of the electrical fault, he had documentation from his own period of ownership, showing that the fault had been identified and flagged, and that the management company had been informed of it before the purchase, which meant they had owned a documented fire risk and done nothing about it. I sat in the cafe window and looked at the street outside and felt something that was almost exhilaration. "Thank you," I said. "Would you be willing to provide that documentation to a solicitor?" He was willing. We spoke for 20 minutes. I took careful notes. By the end of the call, the nature of the legal position had changed substantially, and I sent my solicitor a message summarizing what I had learned before I had even paid for my coffee. She called back in 11 minutes. "With this," she said, "the offer changes." "I know," I said. "Considerably," she said. "I know," I said. "I will leave it in your hands." I sat in the cafe for a while after the calls, feeling the particular satisfaction of a situation resolving in a direction that is not only good but correct, the way a structural calculation resolves when all the variables finally account for themselves and the answer is stable and true. I thought about the building management company that had prioritized its financial exposure over 12 people's lives, and that was now going to discover what happens when documentation exists and is found by people who know how to use it. I felt no particular drama about this. It was simply consequence, arriving at the appropriate time. Then I packed up my laptop and walked back to the apartment in the late afternoon light and made dinner, because it was Thursday, and on Thursdays Cade came home at 5:30 and was always, without fail, hungry. He came home at 5:30 and was hungry. I told him about the call from Edmund Ferris over dinner, and he listened with the attentive quality that I had come to know as his default mode of receiving information, absorbing everything without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Good," with a simplicity that meant several things at once. "It is good," I agreed. "You are good at this," he said, dealing with difficulty without becoming it. I thought about this. "I have had practice," I said, "at managing things quietly. I am learning that there is a difference between managing something and handling it. Managing keeps everything contained. Handling actually moves it." He looked at me with that direct, dark gaze. "What are you handling right now?" he said. The question was not about the insurance. I knew that, and he knew I knew it. "I am handling," I said, carefully, "the fact that I have been living in your apartment for 10 days, and I am not looking for a new one with any urgency, and I am not certain whether that is practical wisdom about the insurance timeline or something else. And I thought you should know that I have noticed this about myself." He set his fork down. He looked at me with the same quality of attention he had used in the kitchen on the night of the heat, the kind of looking that does not slide away from what it is seeing. "What would you want," he said, "if the insurance timeline were not a factor?" I took a breath. "I would want," I said, "to stay here until we know what this is. Not indefinitely, not as an assumption, but as a decision we make deliberately. I want to keep having dinners like this one. I want to keep waking up in a place where someone makes coffee and does not require me to be anything particular before I have had it. I want to find out who I am when I am not performing someone else's version of me, and I want to do that finding out somewhere where someone is interested in the answer." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city went about its evening. Cade reached across the table and put his hand over mine on the tabletop. His hands were large and warm, and carried the specific solidity of someone who works with them in difficult circumstances and has learned how much weight they can bear. "Then stay," he said, "until we know what it is, and then stay for whatever it turns out to be." I looked at him. I looked at his hand on mine. I thought about the building on Fenwick Street, which had burned because someone had documented a fault and then chosen not to fix it. I thought about the things I had documented in myself over 3 years and chosen not to address. I thought about the difference between managing and handling, and about a man in a smoke-filled corridor who had said, "I have you, take my hand." "Yes," I said, "that." He turned my hand over and held it properly. We finished dinner. We did the washing up. The evening settled into the comfortable sequence it had been finding its way into over the previous 10 days, and I thought, with something that was becoming recognizable as happiness, that I had been right about the narrow list. The things that mattered were fewer and more specific than the life I had assembled around Ronan had suggested, and the most essential of them were present in this kitchen, in this apartment, in the particular quality of a person who asked what you wanted before he gave you anything. There was a villain in this story. I want to be honest about that, because the story would be incomplete without him, and because incomplete stories do a disservice to the people who lived through them. Ronan did not come to me directly again. He was in many ways too careful for that, too attuned to the social calculus of appearances. What he did instead was continue the quiet reconstruction of events that Sophie had warned me about, the version in which my departure had been an instability, a symptom of something fragile in me, rather than a response to something untenable in us. He told this version to people in our shared professional adjacency, the designers and architects and property developers who moved through the same spaces I did, and he told it with the particular conviction of someone who has rehearsed it long enough to believe it himself. I learned about this, in fragments over the following weeks, through Sophie, and through 2 colleagues who mentioned, carefully, things they had heard, and through the specific discomfort of a client meeting in which the client looked at me with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone who has been given information about you that they are pretending not to have. I did not, initially, do anything about it. I was still in the early stages of establishing my new circumstances, still moving through the practical work of insurance negotiations and address changes and the slow, steady business of learning who I was without the scaffolding of the previous 3 years. I had finite resources, and I was allocating them carefully, and confronting Ronan's narrative reconstruction required a kind of energy that I was not yet sure I had to spare. It was Cade who noticed. not through any surveillance or investigation, but through the particular attentiveness of someone who watches you carefully enough to see the small things. He noticed that I was quieter on certain evenings. He noticed that I checked my phone with a wariness that had not been there in the first 2 weeks. He noticed, with the professional precision of someone trained to read situations quickly and accurately, that something was adding to my existing load. He asked me about it on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the fire, when we were at the farmer's market 2 streets over, which had become a Saturday and sometimes Sunday activity, moving through the stalls in the easy company of 2 people who have figured out each other's rhythms and no longer require the architecture of conversation to maintain their comfort. "Tell me what is adding to it," he said. "Not the insurance. Something else." I told him about Ronan's version of events. All of it, with the specific details that made it concrete rather than vague, the particular words that Sophie had reported, the client meeting, the 2 colleagues. I told it, without minimizing it, because minimizing it had been what I had been doing internally, and it was not working. He listened to all of it, without speaking. When I had finished, he was quiet for a moment, holding a bag of early tomatoes and looking at the middle distance with the focused expression he wore when he was working through something. "What would you want to do about it?" he said. "Not what should you do, not what is the correct strategic response. What would you want?" I thought about it properly, in the way I was learning to think about things, without the pre-editing that my previous life had trained into me. "I want," I said slowly, "to tell the true version in a place where it can be heard. Not to destroy him, not for drama, just to not be the version of events that he has written." He nodded. "How do you want to do that?" I had, I realized, already been thinking about this without knowing I had been thinking about it. My work, my actual work, the interior design that I had been doing seriously and with increasing recognition for 4 years, was the thing that had given me the most genuine visibility in the circles where Ronan's version was circulating. The Harlow project, which I was close to completing, was significant. It was the kind of project that gets written about, that becomes part of a professional record. "I want to finish the Harlow project," I said, "and I want to make it undeniably mine. Not strategically, because it is mine, and it is good, and it deserves to be finished properly." He looked at me with the expression that I had catalogued as the one he wore when something had confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. "Good," he said. "Let's go home." We went home. I worked on the Harlow project with a focus that had the particular quality of work that is being done for its own sake, rather than for any external validation, the kind of focus that produces the best results because it is not burdened by the weight of what the results need to prove. Cade brought me coffee at the kitchen table and asked intelligent questions about the design decisions that forced me to articulate things I had been holding in my head as instinct, and that became clearer and more defensible once I had put them into words. The Harlow project was completed 6 weeks after the fire. It was, I knew, with the specific and unsentimental confidence of someone who knows their own work, good. The clients were pleased in a way that went beyond satisfaction into the kind of genuine delight that is the highest compliment available to a designer, the sense that the space had become more than they had imagined asking for. Petra arranged the documentation and the photographs. The write-up went to 3 publications. One of them ran it as a feature, with my name prominently credited. The professional circles where Ronan's version had been circulating had access to this feature. Professionals read it. Clients read it. The work was evident and specific and entirely mine. A narrative about instability cannot survive contact with evidence of competent and beautiful work, and Ronan's narrative did not survive it. Not dramatically, not with any particular public resolution. It simply became, over the following weeks, less credible, and then not credible, and then a thing that people had half heard and had apparently misunderstood. I did not gloat about this. Gloating would have required me to invest in Ronan's version of events to a degree that gave it more importance than it deserved. What I felt instead was the specific quiet satisfaction of having done good work for its own sake and having let the work be its own answer. That satisfaction was clean and complete and required nothing further from me. Ronan faded from my life with the gradual completeness of a tide going out. The last practical communication was a letter from his solicitor confirming the settlement of our shared financial arrangements, which was fair and which I signed without drama. After that, there was nothing. He was a person I had known, a significant person, a person who had shaped me in ways I was still in the process of understanding and addressing, but he was no longer a presence in my present tense. I did not mourn this. I noted it. The building management company settled. It took 11 weeks from the first declined offer to the final agreement, and the final figure was, as my solicitor had indicated it would be, considerably more generous than the original. The settlement from the legal action involving Edmund Ferris's documentation was additional, and between the two I had the financial foundation for a genuine new beginning, the kind that does not require cutting corners or accepting the first available option. I found a new apartment in the Kelvin district, not because I was required to, not because the arrangement with Cade had stopped working, but because I had come to understand that finding the apartment was itself a necessary step in becoming the person I was becoming, the person who makes deliberate decisions about where they live rather than the person who happens to be somewhere because someone else needed them to be. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building with large south-facing windows and a kitchen with proper light and a small balcony on which I immediately began planning the container garden I had been thinking about since the herbs on the Fenwick Street windowsill had burned. I signed the lease on a Wednesday afternoon and called Cade from the building's front steps. "I have a lease," I said. "Is it a good apartment?" he said. "It is an excellent apartment," I said. "The kitchen light is good, and there is room for a garden on the balcony, and the bones of the building are solid." He was quiet for a moment. "And you are moving into it," he said. "I am moving into it," I said, "but I want to tell you what I am not doing, which is moving away from you. I am moving into my own space because I need to have one. That is different from the other thing." "I know the difference," he said. "I know you know," I said. "I am saying it out loud because I am practicing." The corner of his voice did the thing that corresponded to the corner of his mouth doing the thing. "All right," he said. "When do you need help with the boxes?" There were not very many boxes. This was one of the interesting things about starting over entirely, that the accumulation you had built with someone else was not yours to take, and that the process of assembling a home from nothing was both liberating and occasionally startling, the way a completely empty room is startling, all that unoccupied possibility. I bought things carefully and deliberately, each object chosen for itself rather than as a placeholder or a compromise, and the apartment filled slowly with things that were entirely and specifically mine. Cade helped me move the boxes on a Saturday. He carried things without making it into an event, and assessed the structural situation of the furniture assembly with the professional eye of someone who has spent years understanding how things are put together and what happens when they are not. And he fixed 2 things about the bookshelf that would have been problems later without being asked and without pointing out that they would have been problems later. When the last box was in and the kettle was on, and we were sitting on the floor of the new living room with cups of tea, because I had not yet located the furniture situation, he looked around at the space with the assessing expression. "It suits you," he said. "It does," I agreed. "It feels like mine." He looked at me with those dark eyes. "You look like yours," he said, "more than when I met you." I thought about the mirror in his bathroom on the morning after the heat, the face that had looked more like itself than it had in a while. I thought about the incremental process of the week since, the phone calls, and the legal negotiations, and the work, and the dinners, and the conversations, and the farmers' market Sundays, and the slow, careful project of finding out who Emmett Vielle was when nobody was requiring him to be anything in particular. "I am more mine," I said. "It is ongoing." He reached across the floor and took my hand, the way he had reached across the kitchen table that evening, with the same unhurried certainty. Not claiming, not anchoring, simply connecting. The way you offer a hand to someone who is finding their footing, not because they cannot stand, but because the standing is better when it is not done alone. The apartment was quiet around us. Outside, the Kelvin district was doing its afternoon business, the particular texture of a neighborhood that had existed long enough to know what it was, the market and the waterfront and the streets that had been shaped by the people who moved through them. Somewhere, 8 minutes away, in an apartment that still smelled of cedar and had a reading chair by the window and a mountain photograph above the desk, there was a space I knew very well, a space I would continue to know very well, because the arrangement we had arrived at was not a temporary one, and we both understood this. I had not been looking for rescue when the fire came. I had been looking, in the most unconfident and circuitous way imaginable, for the door, the one that led out of a life I had assembled for someone else, and into one that was genuinely mine. The fire had simply been the moment when the door became unmissable, and on the other side of it had been a man in full gear in a corridor full of smoke, saying, "Here, I have you. Take my hand." I had taken his hand. I was still taking it. Not because I could not navigate on my own, but because navigation is not the same as journey, and a journey is better shared, and I had spent enough time pretending otherwise. Outside the window of my new apartment, the afternoon light was doing something specific and beautiful with the dust in the air, the particular quality of late light that makes ordinary things look briefly extraordinary. I watched it for a moment, and thought that I had not, in 3 years of living with Ronan, once simply sat and watched the light in a room. I had been too busy managing, too occupied with the maintenance of a version of myself that required constant attention to avoid showing its seams. I was not managing now. I was simply here, in my own apartment, with my own tea, with the hand of a person I had chosen holding mine, watching the light do what it wanted with the dust in the air. "I want to tell you something," I said. He waited. I thought, when the fire happened, that it was the worst possible timing, that I was in no state to be making any decisions, that everything that happened in those first days, the hotel, your apartment, the kitchen, all of it, was contaminated by the circumstances, by the displacement and the loss and the particular vulnerability of having nowhere to go. I thought I would need to re-examine everything once I had my footing back, to check whether what I felt was real or whether it was the product of crisis. He was listening with the complete quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. "I have my footing back," I said. "I have checked, and I want you to know that the answer is the same. It is not crisis. It is not gratitude. It is not displacement making something feel more significant than it is. It is actually what I thought it was. I thought you should know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I have been waiting for you to get here, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted you to arrive at it yourself, without me being in any hurry." "I know you were not in a hurry," I said. "I am not in a hurry about any of this," he said. "You can take as long as you need to become exactly who you are. I will be here when you get there." I looked at him. I thought about patience, about the specific quality of it that was not passive but active, the patience of someone who understands that some things cannot be rushed without being damaged, who is willing to wait at the right distance while a thing takes the shape it needs to take. I had not encountered this kind of patience before, in a person who was asking for something in return. I was still learning how to receive it without looking for the catch. "There is no catch," he said, as if he had read the specific quality of my silence. "I know," I said. "I am learning to know it." He squeezed my hand. "Good," he said. "Keep learning." We finished our tea on the floor of my new apartment. He stayed for dinner, which I made in the new kitchen with the south-facing light going golden in the late afternoon the way I had already known it would. And we ate at the table I had bought specifically because it had room for two, without being so large that one person at it felt conspicuous. After dinner, we sat on the small balcony in the spring evening, and I showed him the plans for the container garden, the herbs and the trailing plants, and the one small fruit tree I was going to attempt in a very large pot, because I had found, in the process of losing everything and starting again, that I very much liked growing things. He looked at the plans with genuine interest and asked practical questions about drainage and load-bearing, which led to a conversation about structural considerations in container gardening that was both deeply domestic and thoroughly informed by his professional expertise, and which made me laugh in the easy, spontaneous way that I was finding happened more and more often in his company, the laugh of someone who is in the right place. The city was dark by the time he left. He kissed me at the door of my apartment, the same way he had in his kitchen, deliberate and unhurried, and then he said good night and went down the stairs with the quiet, purposeful tread that I had come to know as one of the most familiar sounds in the world, and I closed the door and stood in my own hallway in my own apartment for a moment, simply being there. I walked through the rooms. They were mine, every inch of them, every deliberately chosen object, every surface I had cleaned and arranged without reference to anyone else's preferences. The kitchen with its good light, the living room with its space for books I was going to buy, the balcony where the container garden was going to grow, the bedroom with its east-facing window, which would bring the morning light in at the angle I had tested specifically before signing the lease. I was Emmett Vale, 36 days after the fire, in my own apartment in the Kelvin district, with a legal settlement that had been won by my own refusal to accept the insufficient offer, and a professional reputation that had been expressed and defended through the quality of my own work, and a relationship that was genuinely and freely chosen, and a list of things that mattered that had never been shorter or more accurate. I went to bed. I slept without managing anything. In the morning the light came in exactly the way I had calculated it would, warm and clear and specifically, particularly mine. There is one more thing I want to tell you. 6 weeks after I moved into the new apartment, my solicitor received confirmation of the final settlement from the building management company. The amount was appropriate. The documentation of the company's prior knowledge of the electrical fault had been submitted to the relevant regulatory body, and an investigation had been opened. 12 families had received settlements. The company's operating license was under review. Edmund Ferris sent me a note thanking me for the way I had handled the documentation process, and I sent one back thanking him for calling a stranger with information that changed everything. Ronan, in the same week, was passed over for a senior partnership at his firm in favor of a colleague. I learned this from Sophie, who reported it with a neutrality that was itself a kind of verdict. He was, she said, apparently surprised. I thought about the version of events he had been circulating, about stability and instability, about what it cost to spend energy reconstructing someone else's story rather than attending to your own, and I found that I had no particular feeling about his situation beyond the faint residual sadness you carry for time that was genuinely spent, the years that were real even when the relationship that contained them was not. I wished him, privately, and without any need to express it to him, something better, and then I put the subject down and went back to the balcony, where the herbs were coming in with the particular enthusiasm of things that have been properly housed and properly tended, and where there was a cup of coffee that Cade had made before leaving for his morning shift, left on the small table, with a note that said the parsley is taking over, suggests strategic intervention, and which made me smile with the specific warmth of someone who has found the right person and knows it and is no longer afraid of knowing it. I sat in the morning light with the coffee and looked at the parsley and thought that I would deal with it later. There was time. There was, it turned out, a great deal of time when you were no longer spending all of it on management. The container garden would need attention. The new project Petra had sent over would need starting. Cade would come back from his shift at 6, and I would make dinner, and we would eat at the table, with room for two, and talk about the things that interested us, which were numerous and various and always surprising. The morning light moved across the balcony floor. The parsley was indeed taking over. The city carried on below, indifferent and ordinary, and full of the particular beauty of things continuing. I finished the coffee. I picked up the pruning scissors. I got to work.